Year 1204. On the deck of a Venetian war galley, an old man stands against the wind. Wind tears at banners and sails, crimson banners of the Lion of St. Mark. He's nearly 90 years old, a frail figure wrapped in opulent robes. His eyes, milky and white, stare blankly toward a distant shore he cannot see. They say he was blinded decades ago in the city he now approaches with an army. To any observer, he might seem like a relic, a mere figurehead, but well, looks can be deceiving. This man is no passenger. He is the architect of this entire enterprise. He is the mind behind the largest amphibious invasion the world has yet seen. His name is Enrico Dandolo. He cannot see the formidable walls of Constantinople rising from the horizon. He cannot see the thousands of Crusader knights. He cannot see the Venetian marines who look to him for command. He cannot see the glint of sunlight on the steel of their swords. He cannot see the anxious faces of the men who have gambled everything on his leadership. His world is one of perpetual darkness, yet his vision for Venice's future is clearer than anyone's. The Crusaders, knights from the great houses of France, knights from the Holy Roman Empire, they had come to Venice seeking passage to Egypt. They were filled with pious fervor, ready to reclaim the Holy Land. But they were short on funds, unable to pay the staggering price Venice demanded. It was then that this old blind Doge stepped forward. He saw not a problem, but an opportunity. He saw a tool, an army for hire. This was no longer just a crusade. It had become something else entirely. Under Dandolo's quiet, unyielding direction, it transformed into a masterclass in political maneuvering, debt, ambition, vengeance. The target was no longer the Holy Land, but the heart of a rival empire. The blind Doge had turned Europe's holy zeal into a weapon aimed at Byzantium. He was about to unleash it. The world would be reshaped by a man who could not see the chaos he would orchestrate. How did this happen? How did a man, supposedly on the brink of death and deprived of his sight, come to command such power? This is the central paradox of Enrico Dandolo. He was a leader who never saw a single battlefield he conquered, a strategist whose genius lay not in military tactics, but in the subtle manipulation of finance, religion, human ambition. He understood that true power was not always won with the sword. Sometimes it was forged in contracts leveraged through debt and secured through the exploitation of others' faith. He couldn't see the world, so he decided to remake it in an image that would benefit Venice. Our story will untangle this remarkable and brutal saga. We will journey back to the glistening canals of a rising Venice, a republic built on trade and naval might, constantly navigating the treacherous currents of medieval politics. We will explore its delicate relationship with the powerful Byzantine Empire, alliance rivalry that set the stage for Dandolo's audacious gambit. The balance of power in the Mediterranean was a fragile thing. Dandolo knew exactly where to apply pressure to make the entire structure collapse in his favor, creating a new order from the ruins. We will trace the rise of Enrico Dandolo himself, from diplomat in the great halls of Constantinople to the hardened, ruthless politician who returned to Venice. We will examine the moment he was allegedly blinded, an act of imperial arrogance that may have planted the seeds of a long, simmering revenge. This was not just business. For Dandolo, it became personal. His election as Doge in his 80s was not honorary. It was the final, critical move of a master player positioning himself for the endgame he had planned for years. This is the story of how a holy war was hijacked. The Fourth Crusade, intended to liberate Jerusalem, was diverted to sack the Christian city of Constantinople. We will follow Dandolo as he weaponizes the Crusaders' debt, ignores the Pope's fury, and makes a devil's bargain with an exiled prince. He would bring an ancient empire to its knees, not for God, but for the glory and profit of Venice. He never lifted a sword, yet he conquered more than any general of his time, leaving behind a legacy of unparalleled Venetian dominance and a moral stain that has never quite washed away. to understand the man. We must first understand the city that made him. Venice was not like other cities. It was an impossibility, a dream conjured from salt marsh and seawater, while the great powers of Europe built their foundations on solid earth, drawing strength from feudal lords and vast tracts of farmland. Venice rose from a desolate lagoon on the northeastern coast of Italy. It had no land to speak of, no fields to plough, no great armies of knights to muster. Its foundations were not stone, but wood pilings driven deep into the mud. Its streets were not dirt or cobblestone, they were canals of shimmering brackish water. This unique geography was a vulnerability and a profound strength. Separated from the Italian mainland, Venice was insulated from the endless wars and political turmoil that plagued the peninsula. The Lombards, the Franks, the Holy Roman emperors could cross Italy with armies, but the lagoon was a natural fortress, a moat protecting the city from conquest. This isolation forced the Venetians to look outward, not to the land, but to the sea. The Adriatic was their backyard, the Mediterranean their great frontier. Survival depended not on agriculture, but on trade, on mastering the waves and the winds, to connect the markets of the West with the riches of the East. The soul of Venice was mercantile. Its heroes were not knights in shining armor, but shrewd merchants and daring sea captains. Its nobility was not ancient landed titles, but wealth accumulated through commerce. The city was a republic, governed not by a hereditary monarch but by an elected Doge, a first among equals, his power checked by councils and committees. The Serenissima Republica was designed to prevent any single family or individual from seizing absolute power. It was a government built for stability and predictability, and the relentless pursuit of profit ensuring that the state's interests aligned with its powerful citizens. The Maritime Republic was a paradox. It was a Christian state that traded enthusiastically with Muslim caliphates. Nominally Italian, Venice often felt closer to Alexandria and Constantinople than to the politics of Rome or Milan. Its people were pragmatic and worldly, their faith tempered by the practical necessities of international commerce. They understood that wealth was power, and that the key to wealth lay in controlling the flow of goods across the sea. This was the world that shaped Enrico Dandolo, a world where the bottom line was as sacred as the cross, and a signed contract could be as mighty as a king's decree. Venice's power was built on a simple premise: buy low in the east, sell high in the west. The city positioned itself as the indispensable middleman of Europe. From the ports of the Levant, Venetian galleys brought back spices like pepper, cloves, and cinnamon, exotic silks from China, precious gems, sophisticated glassware. These were the luxury goods that the kings, nobles, and wealthy churchmen craved, and Venice controlled the supply. In the other direction, their ships carried timber, iron, and enslaved people from the Slavic lands. To the markets of Byzantium, to the markets of the Islamic world, every transaction, every voyage, added another sliver of gold to the city's swelling coffers. This vast trading network required an equally vast and powerful navy to protect it. The Venetian arsenal, or Arsenal di Venezia, was the heart of this naval power. Perhaps the first truly industrial factory complex in European history, it was a marvel of efficiency and scale. Thousands of workers, shipwrights, rope makers, blacksmiths, sail makers, labored in a sprawling state-owned shipyard. Using standardized parts and assembly line techniques, the arsenal could produce a fully equipped war galley in a single day. Assembly line production and prefabricated parts in motion. Finished war galley ready for sea. This industrial might gave Venice a decisive edge, allowing it to build and maintain a fleet that could dominate trade routes, fight off pirates, and project its power across the Mediterranean Sea. In the treacherous political landscape of the 12th century, Venice survived by being nimble and opportunistic. It was a master of playing larger powers against each other, forging and breaking alliances as its interest dictated. The city's primary concerns were always the same: keeping its trade routes open, preventing any single rival from becoming powerful enough to threaten its maritime supremacy. A delicate diplomatic dance, a constant balancing act between the three great powers, the papacy in Rome, the Holy Roman Empire in Germany and northern Italy, and the Byzantine Empire in the east. With the papacy, Venice maintained a relationship of convenience. As a devoutly Catholic city, it respected the Pope's spiritual authority, but fiercely guarded its political and commercial independence. When popes called for embargoes against Muslim powers, Venetian merchants often quietly ignored them, drawn to lucrative Eastern markets. This led to friction and threats of excommunication from Rome. Yet the papacy needed Venice's navy for crusading ambitions, creating a grudging codependency and occasional cooperation. To its west, the Holy Roman Empire under Frederick Barbarossa sought control over wealthy northern Italian city-states. Venice, protected by its lagoon, remained largely independent of imperial control. While other cities exhausted themselves in feudal wars, Venice focused on the sea, profiting from the resulting instability. Venice had few true friends, but few permanent enemies. Its foreign policy was ruthlessly pragmatic, driven by a clear-eyed assessment of its own interests. This environment forged Enrico Dandolo's political mind, teaching him that loyalty was a tool and every crisis was an opportunity in disguise. Of all its relationships, none was more complex or more critical to Venice than the one it shared with the Byzantine Empire. For centuries, Constantinople had been both Venice's protector and its greatest rival. In its early days, Venice had been a nominal vassal of the Byzantine Empire, and this connection had provided the young republic with legitimacy and, most importantly, preferential access to the immense markets of the East. A treaty known as the Golden Bull had granted Venetian merchants extraordinary trading privileges within the empire, allowing them to trade tax-free in many Byzantine ports. This concession was the bedrock of Venetian prosperity and the source of its early competitive advantage. However, this relationship was fraught with tension. The Byzantines, who viewed themselves as the true heirs of the Roman Empire, looked down on the Venetians as upstart merchants, useful but ultimately inferior. They resented the growing arrogance and wealth of the Venetian trading colony in Constantinople, which had become a state within a state, home to thousands of expatriates who operated outside local laws. As Venice grew stronger and more independent, its reliance on Byzantine goodwill transformed into a powerful commercial rivalry. The student was beginning to outgrow the master, and both sides knew it. The Byzantine Empire, beset by enemies on all sides and plagued by internal decay, grew weaker. Emperors in Constantinople began to see the privileged Venetian position as a threat to their own economy and sovereignty. In 1171, Emperor Manuel I Komnenos took drastic action. In a single day, he ordered the arrest of all Venetians in the empire, perhaps as many as 10,000, and the seizure of all their ships and property. This was a catastrophic blow to Venice, a humiliation that exposed the fragility of its position. It was during these tumultuous years that a Venetian diplomat named Enrico Dandolo was active in Constantinople, an experience that would leave an indelible mark on him. This event shattered the old symbiosis between the two powers. Though a fragile peace was eventually restored, the trust was gone forever. For Venice, the lesson was clear. Its entire economic model was vulnerable, dependent on the whims of a foreign emperor. To secure its future, Venice could no longer be a junior partner. It needed to be the master of its own destiny. The city began to see the Byzantine Empire not as a partner or even just a rival, but as an obstacle, a decaying giant whose vast wealth and strategic ports were ripe for the taking. The stage was set for a final violent confrontation. Enrico Dandolo was born around the year 1107, a child of the Venetian Republic in every sense. He was not born into the highest echelons of the city's aristocracy. The Dandolo clan was considered part of the minor nobility, a family whose status was built more on recent commercial success and on shrewd political maneuvering. This background was crucial. From a young age, Enrico would have understood that in Venice, A man's fortune and influence were not simply inherited, they had to be earned, defended, and constantly expanded through ambition, intelligence, and a healthy dose of ruthlessness. His world was not one of landed estates, but of counting houses, shipyards, political councils. He grew up in a city that was a whirlwind of global commerce and constant political calculation. The conversations he overheard in the piazzas and on the Rialto Bridge would have been about silk prices in Antioch, trade winds in the Aegean, the latest political intrigue from the courts of popes and emperors. He learned early that information was the most valuable currency. Venice's survival depended on its ability to outthink and outmaneuver its larger, more powerful neighbors. His family's standing ensured he received a formidable education, not just in letters, law, but in the practical arts of statecraft. He was groomed for a life of service to the Republic, a path that would inevitably lead to diplomacy, commerce. A successful merchant voyage could elevate a family's status. A key diplomatic appointment could open up new commercial opportunities. For a young man like Dandolo, serving Venice was synonymous with serving the interests of his family and his class. He was not a romantic knight or a pious crusader. He was a businessman with the soul of a predator, steeped in the city's culture of pragmatic self-interest. He saw the world as a grand ledger of assets and liabilities, and he was determined to ensure Venice ended up on the winning side. As Enrico Dandolo entered middle age, his talents for negotiation and statecraft became indispensable to the Republic. Venice increasingly sent him on its most critical diplomatic missions, and no destination was more important or more perilous than the magnificent city of Constantinople. He had to navigate the opulent, treacherous world of the imperial palace. Elaborate ceremony, whispered conspiracies, deeply ingrained arrogance. Dandolo would have walked the grand avenues of a city that dwarfed any in Western Europe. He would have stood in the awe-inspiring presence of the Hagia Sophia, its massive dome seeming to float on a cascade of light. He would have negotiated in gilded halls with silk-robed eunuchs and powerful imperial officials who saw the world through a lens of ancient superiority. His task was to defend Venice's lucrative trading privileges, secured by the Golden Bull, against an imperial government that was growing ever more resentful of the Venetians' wealth and influence. During these years, Dandolo learned two vital lessons that would shape his destiny. First, he gained an intimate, first-hand knowledge of the Byzantine Empire's strengths and, more importantly, its weaknesses. He saw the rot beneath the gilded surface, the political instability, the succession crises, the court factions that constantly plotted against one another, and the slow decay of its military power. He understood the empire's reliance on foreign mercenaries and its financial fragility. Second, he developed a profound and personal understanding of Byzantine pride and condescension. He would have endured the subtle and not so subtle humiliations that imperial officials so often inflicted upon barbarian envoys from the West. He was a representative of a powerful republic, yet in Constantinople he was treated as a subordinate, a mere merchant petitioning his masters. This experience likely fostered a deep-seated resentment, a feeling that Venice would never be truly secure or respected, as long as it lived in the shadow of Constantinople. It was a resentment that simmered beneath the surface of diplomatic protocol, waiting for the right moment to boil over into open conflict. The simmering tensions between Venice and Byzantium finally erupted in 1171. The Byzantine Emperor, Manuel I Komnenos, frustrated by Venetian arrogance and their dominance of his empire's trade, made a shocking move. On a single day, he ordered the arrest of every Venetian man, every Venetian woman, every Venetian child within his borders. He seized their ships, their warehouses, and all their valuable goods. Thousands of Venetians were thrown into prisons. It was a devastating blow to the Republic, a calculated act of imperial power designed to cripple its commercial rival. According to some historical accounts and later legends, Enrico Dandolo was a key member of this diplomatic mission. The negotiations were tense and ultimately fruitless. The story goes that during a heated argument with the emperor, Dandolo's boldness and defiance so enraged the Byzantine court that a terrible punishment was meted out. It is said that the emperor ordered him to be blinded. The method was allegedly not by blade, which might have been seen as too merciful, but by a heated glass or metal plate held close to his eyes, destroying the optic nerves without removing the eyeballs themselves. Whether this dramatic story is literally true is a matter of historical debate, but the truth of the event is less important than the power of the legend that grew around it. For the Venetians, this story crystallized their hatred for Byzantine treachery. Dandolo became a living symbol of the empire's perfidy and cruelty. When Dandolo eventually returned to Venice, he was a changed man. The world had been plunged into darkness for him, but this physical blindness seems only to have sharpened his inner vision and hardened his resolve. The darkness that enveloped him did not extinguish his ambition, it focused it. He began to see the world not with his eyes, but through a cold, clear lens of strategic calculation, waiting patiently for the day he could settle the score. For the next decade and a half, Enrico Dandolo lived in a perpetual twilight, his public career seemingly over. While other men might have retired broken by such an injury, Dandolo waited. He remained active in the background of Venetian politics. He watched the Republic struggle to recover from the disaster of 1171. He saw Venice launch a retaliatory expedition against Byzantium. That armada was decimated by plague. He witnessed the political turmoil that followed, including the assassination of a Doge. He observed, he learned, he planned. Deprived of sight, he relied on other senses, his hearing, his memory, his intellect. He became a master listener. He dissected conversations. He discerned hidden motives. His blindness became political strength. He was a constant presence, a reminder of Byzantine treachery and Venetian resilience. He was patient as younger men took the spotlight. He watched the Mediterranean balance of power shift, his reputation to grow. He became an elder statesman of moral authority. That moment arrived in 1192. The Doge of Venice died. The 41 electors gathered to choose his successor. To the astonishment of many, their choice fell upon the aged and blind Enrico Dandolo. He was round 85 years old, an age when most men were long since in their graves. Appointing a blind octogenarian to lead the most dynamic commercial power in Europe seemed madness, or at best symbolic. But the electors were not fools. They saw in Dandolo not a frail old man, but the sharpest political mind in the Republic. They knew his blindness was irrelevant. His vision for Venice was what mattered. They thought he would not live long enough to become a tyrant. They thought they were choosing a short-term caretaker doge. They were profoundly mistaken. Upon his election, Dandolo delivered a speech that dispelled notions of him as a mere figurehead. He spoke with a clarity and force that belied his age, laying out a vision for Venetian glory. He swore the promissione ducale, promising to uphold the laws and to seek the good of the Republic above all else. He moved with surprising vigor, quickly taking firm control of the government. He immediately began policies to stabilize the Venetian currency, renegotiate treaties, and project the Republic's power with newfound confidence. This would not be a quiet, ceremonial reign. The blind Doge had finally ascended to the throne. After decades of waiting, the man humiliated in Constantinople was now the absolute leader of the Venetian Republic. All the knowledge, the resentment, and the ambition he had accumulated were now at his command, backed by the industrial might of the arsenal and the immense wealth of the city's merchants. He had a personal score to settle and a patriotic duty to enrich his homeland. The most unlikely leader had taken the stage, and he was about to set in motion a chain of events that would bring him revenge, upend the world order, and reshape the map of Christendom. In the year 1198, a new and formidable force ascended to the papal throne. Pope Innocent III, a man of immense ambition, legal brilliance, and unshakable belief in papal supremacy over Christendom's secular rulers. His primary goal was the launching of a new crusade to reclaim Jerusalem. The failures of previous crusades had been a source of shame for the Church. He envisioned a massive, well-organized army, not to strike at the depleted lands of Palestine, but to strike at the heart of Ayyubid power in Egypt. He issued a powerful call to arms. He sent preachers across France, across Germany, and the Low Countries. His message resonated with the chivalric ideals of the European nobility: knights, barons, counts, men like Theobald of Champagne and Baldwin of Flanders. They were stirred by the promise of spiritual salvation and by the chance to win glory and land in the East. Unlike previous crusades, this one was to be a professional affair, commanded by the great lords of Western Europe. They swore sacred vows, they took the cross, and they began to assemble their forces for the Holy War. However, the Pope's grand strategy had one critical logistical flaw. To invade Egypt, the crusading army needed to travel by sea. They had no fleet of their own, an estimated 33,000 men, and 4,500 horses. The land route through Anatolia was seen as too perilous. This meant they had to contract a maritime power to provide transport. Only a few cities could manage such an undertaking, and one stood out: the Republic of Venice. The path of the crusade was about to cross with the ambitions of the blind Doge, and so, in early 1201, a delegation of 6 prominent Crusader knights made their way to Venice. Their mission was simple: to negotiate a contract for a fleet to carry their army to Egypt's shores. They arrived with high hopes, ready to bargain with the famous merchant princes of the lagoon city. What they were not prepared for was the man they were about to meet. They were about to enter into a negotiation not just with a city, but with Enrico Dandolo, a master strategist who saw in their pious quest not a holy cause, but the business opportunity of a lifetime. The fate of their crusade was now in his hands. When the French envoys arrived in Venice, they were granted an audience with Doge Enrico Dandolo. They presented their request with the confidence of noblemen representing the flower of European chivalry. The blind Doge listened patiently, his unseeing eyes giving away nothing of his thoughts. He understood immediately the scale of what was being asked and the immense leverage it gave him. This was not a simple charter. This was a request that would require Venice to dedicate its entire national effort to a single, colossal project. The arsenal would have to go into overdrive, producing transports and war galleys at an unprecedented rate. It was an enormous risk, one that could bankrupt the city if the Crusaders failed to uphold their end of the bargain. But Dandolo also saw the immense potential. After a period of calculated deliberation within the Venetian councils, Dandolo presented the Crusaders with his terms. The deal was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. Venice would provide transport ships for 4,500 knights and their horses, 9,000 squires, 20,000 foot soldiers. They would also provide provisions for this entire army for 9 months. In addition, the Republic would contribute 50 fully armed war galleys as its own contribution to the crusade, on the condition that Venice would receive half of all conquests, both territory and treasure. The price for this service was a staggering 85,000 silver marks, a colossal sum equivalent to several times the annual income of the King of France or England. The Crusader envoys were stunned by the price but had little choice. After some deliberation they agreed to the terms, and a treaty was solemnly signed and sealed in St. Mark's Basilica. The deal was to be fulfilled by June of 1202, when the entire crusading army was to assemble at the Lido, the outer island of the Venetian lagoon, ready to embark for Egypt. The envoys departed, confident that they had secured the means for their holy war. Back in Venice, Dandolo set the city's mighty industrial machine in motion. For the next year, the entire Republic worked with a singular purpose: building the grandest fleet Christendom had ever seen, all while the bill for the Crusaders came due. Throughout the summer of 1202, the crusading army began to arrive. Knights, soldiers, and pilgrims from across Europe converged on the Venetian Lido, setting up a vast, sprawling camp on the sandy island. But as the weeks turned into months, a serious problem became apparent. The number of crusaders arriving was far smaller than anticipated. Instead of the 33,500 men the leaders had planned for and promised, only about 12,000 had actually shown up. This shortfall was about to trigger a catastrophic financial crisis. The Crusader leaders had based their contract with Venice on the assumption that each soldier would pay a portion of the passage fee. With less than half the expected number of men, they found themselves unable to collect the full amount owed. They pooled all their resources, melting down their personal silver and gold plate, and begging for contributions from the rank and file. Despite their best efforts, after they had paid everything they could muster, they were still short. The deficit was a devastating 34,000 silver marks. They had come to Venice to embark on a holy war, but now they were trapped, stranded on an island, and deeply in debt to their Venetian hosts, who held the keys to their magnificent and now useless fleet. Enrico Dandolo and the Venetians had fulfilled their side of the contract to the letter. A spectacular fleet of hundreds of ships lay at anchor, fully provisioned and ready to sail. They had invested their entire city's fortune and effort for over a year. They could not and would not simply let the Crusaders off the hook. Dandolo cut off supplies to the increasingly desperate army on the Lido. The Crusaders, once proud knights, were now effectively prisoners, their camp plagued by hunger, disease, and plummeting morale. Their holy mission had ground to a halt before it had even begun. The Crusader leaders were humiliated and desperate. They pleaded with the Doge, offering their own valuables as collateral, but it was not enough. Dandolo remained firm. The contract was the contract. The full price had to be paid. He held all the cards. The blind Doge let the pressure build, allowing the Crusaders' desperation to reach a fever pitch. He was not looking for a way to solve their problem. He was waiting for the perfect moment to present them with his own solution, a solution that had nothing to do with Jerusalem or Egypt. As autumn approached and the Crusader camp grew more desperate, Enrico Dandolo revealed his hand. He gathered the distressed leaders and made them a proposition. He told them there was another way to fulfill the obligation, a simple proposal, an offer that looked reasonable on the surface. He explained Zara, on the Dalmatian coast, had rebelled against Venice and sought the King of Hungary's protection. The campaigning season was late, and sailing to Egypt before winter was impossible. So he proposed a detour, help Venice recapture Zara, and he would suspend their debt until they could pay with later spoils of war. For the Crusader leaders, it was a lifeline and a moral crisis. It would save the army from disintegrating and keep the crusade alive. But Zara was a Christian city. Its protector, the King of Hungary, had taken the cross, technically a fellow crusader under papal protection. Dandolo framed it not as betrayal but as practical necessity. He made it a small pragmatic step toward the true goal. The Doge pledged to take the cross himself, leading Venetian forces, political theatre that legitimized the plan. Caught between ruin and compromise, the leaders reluctantly agreed. Dandolo had turned the Army of Christ into Venice's collection agency. In October 1202, the great fleet finally set sail from Venice. It was a magnificent spectacle. Hundreds of ships with sails emblazoned with the cross, decks crowded with thousands of knights and soldiers. But their destination was not the coast of Egypt. It was the Christian city of Zara. The blind Doge, Enrico Dandolo, stood on the prow of his galley, a man nearly 90 years old, personally leading the fleet. When the fleet arrived before the formidable walls of Zara, the city's inhabitants were shocked and terrified. They tried to appeal to the Crusaders' faith, hanging banners marked with crosses from the city walls to show that they too were Christians. A significant faction, led by Simon de Montfort, was horrified and refused to attack a fellow Christian city. However, Dandolo and the main leaders held firm. The Doge argued Zara was a city of rebels and pirates that rightfully belonged to Venice, and the Crusaders were bound by contract to assist. The siege began in earnest. The Venetians brought forth advanced siege engines, massive catapults hurling enormous stones at the walls. After just 5 days of bombardment on November 24, 1202, the city of Zara surrendered. Despite promises the city would be spared, it was brutally sacked. Soldiers, idle and frustrated, went on a rampage, looting homes, looting churches, looting palaces. The spoils were collected and divided between the Venetians and the Crusaders, the Venetian share, to pay down the army's outstanding debt. The first objective of Dandolo's revised plan was complete. The crusade had drawn its first blood, but it was the blood of fellow Catholics. The moral Rubicon had been crossed. News of the atrocity was already on its way to an infuriated Pope in Rome. News of the sack of Zara reached Pope Innocent III with shocking speed. He was utterly apoplectic. From the very beginning he had been wary of Venice's involvement, fearing their commercial interests would corrupt the spiritual mission of the crusade. Now, his worst fears had been realized. He issued a bull of excommunication against the entire crusading army and all the Venetians involved. This was the ultimate spiritual sanction, denied them the sacraments, and condemned their souls to eternal damnation. The letter containing the excommunication was sent to the army wintering in Zara. The papal legate presented it to the leaders, plunging the camp into spiritual crisis and panic. The French Crusaders, the German Crusaders. They immediately dispatched an embassy to Rome to beg for the Pope's forgiveness, professing their deep remorse and blaming their desperation for their terrible actions. Pope Innocent, not wanting to lose the entire army, eventually relented. He agreed to lift the excommunication from the Crusaders on condition they make amends and proceed immediately to the Holy Land. However, his forgiveness came with one massive exception. The Venetians, whom he saw as the unrepentant architects of the entire affair, were to remain excommunicated. Enrico Dandolo's reaction to this news was a masterstroke of political defiance. When the papal bull arrived, he simply suppressed it. He refused to allow it to be read publicly to the Venetian contingent. As far as his men were concerned, they were still in the good graces of the Church. Dandolo, the ultimate pragmatist, treated the Pope's spiritual thunder with complete indifference. As the crusading army wintered in the conquered city of Zara, a new and unexpected player arrived. This was no knight or papal legate, it was a prince in exile, Alexios Angelos. He was the son of the deposed Byzantine emperor Isaac II Angelus. The young Alexios escaped Byzantine custody. He toured the courts of Europe, desperately seeking military aid. His quest had been fruitless until he heard of the massive indebted crusading army sitting idle in Zara. The young prince, accompanied by his German patrons, arrived at the camp with a proposition. He presented himself to the leaders of the crusade and to the ever-watchful Enrico Dandolo. He promised to pay off the Crusaders' entire remaining debt to Venice, 34,000 silver marks. He pledged an additional 200,000 silver marks to the army as a reward. He promised to provision their entire army for a year. He would personally join the crusade to Egypt with 10,000 Byzantine soldiers. He vowed to end the Great Schism and submit the Eastern Orthodox Church to the authority of the Pope in Rome. For the Crusader leaders, this was a moment of profound temptation. Alexios's proposal offered them everything they lacked: money. It offered supplies, it offered reinforcements, it offered a path to papal forgiveness for the sin of Zara. But it also meant another delay, another diversion from the Holy Land. While the French and the German knights debated the morality and the piety of the prince's offer, Enrico Dandolo saw it through a lens of pure, cold-eyed strategic calculation. The young Alexios was not a prince to be pitied, but a key that could unlock the gates of Constantinople. the city that had humiliated him and stood as Venice's greatest commercial rival. Dandolo threw his immense authority behind the plan. He argued forcefully in the Crusaders' council. Why, he asked, should they sail to Egypt to fight a powerful and well-prepared enemy, when they could first stop at Constantinople, secure immense wealth, gain powerful reinforcements, and fulfill a just cause all at once? His advocacy was decisive. For Dandolo, this was about far more than the 200,000 silver marks. It was about securing a permanent foothold for Venice within the Byzantine Empire. Installing a puppet emperor who owed his throne entirely to Venetian and Crusader arms would give the Republic unprecedented control over its trade routes and commercial privileges. The prince's offer was the perfect pretext for achieving this long-held Venetian ambition. Despite strong objections from a faction of Crusaders who saw the plan for what it was, a greedy worldly diversion, the deal was struck. The main body of the army, led by men like Boniface of Montferrat and Baldwin of Flanders, formally agreed to divert to Constantinople. The objectors, led by Simon de Montfort, abandoned the crusade in disgust and made their own way to the Holy Land. In the spring of 1203, the great fleet, with the young Alexios now aboard, set sail from Zara. Enrico Dandolo, the excommunicated Doge, was leading the army of Christ to attack the greatest Christian city in the world, all under the banner of a bargain he almost certainly knew could never be kept. In late June 1203, the Crusader fleet arrived before the mighty Theodosian walls of Constantinople. The sight left the Western knights in awe. The massive walls had repelled sieges for nearly 1,000 years, seemingly impenetrable. The Crusaders and Venetians knew a direct assault on the main land walls would be suicidal. Instead, they devised a brilliant, daring plan. The French knights would land on the shore of the Golden Horn and attack the weaker fortifications near the imperial palace. Meanwhile, the Venetians would launch a direct amphibious assault on the sea walls. This required a perilous first step, breaking the massive chain across the mouth of the Golden Horn. A Venetian galley, fitted with a giant pair of shears on its prow, sailed at full speed and snapped the chain. The fleet poured into the harbour. On the deck of his flagship, the blind and ancient Enrico Dandolo shamed his men into action. Seeing them hesitate, he ordered his crew to row him ashore, demanding they plant the banner of St. Mark on the battlements or kill him trying. Inspired by their nonagenarian Doge's courage, the Venetians surged forward. Dandolo himself was among the first to land on enemy soil. They stormed the walls, capturing a section of the ramparts and setting fire to the nearby buildings. The fire spread, creating panic within the city. Faced with the Venetian breakthrough and the French assault, Alexios III lost his nerve. That night, he gathered a vast amount of treasure and fled the city, abandoning his people and his throne. The blinded emperor Isaac II was released from his prison and restored to the throne, with his son, the young Alexios, crowned as co-emperor Alexios IV. The Crusaders had won. They now stood outside the city gates, victorious, waiting for the massive payment and reinforcements they had been promised. Their victory, however, would prove to be dangerously hollow. The Crusaders' triumph quickly soured. Once on the throne, Alexios IV found himself in an impossible position. He had made promises in exile that he could not keep. The imperial treasury had been looted by his fleeing uncle. It was virtually empty. To raise the promised 200,000 silver marks, he imposed crushing taxes on his people. He confiscated precious icons and relics from the city's churches. As months dragged on, relations deteriorated into open hostility. Brawls between soldiers and citizens became common. In one incident, a group of crusaders sought to plunder a mosque. Locals attacked them. In the ensuing chaos, the crusaders set a fire to cover their retreat. The blaze raged out of control for days. It destroyed a huge swath of the city and left thousands homeless. Within the city, a powerful anti-Latin faction was rising, led by Alexios Doukas, Mourzouflos. In late January 1204, Mourzouflos made his move. He staged a palace coup. He seized and strangled Alexios IV. He imprisoned the blind father Isaac II, who died shortly after. Mourtzouphlos was then crowned Emperor Alexios V. The Crusaders were now in a dire situation. They were stranded deep in hostile territory. Their supposed ally was dead. Their source of payment was gone. A new aggressive emperor was on the throne. It was Enrico Dandolo and the Venetian leadership who provided the path forward. There was no more talk of restoring rightful rulers. The objective was now conquest. In April 1204, after regrouping and preparing for a final assault, the Crusaders and Venetians launched their attack. But on April 12th, they tried again. The Venetians lashed their ships together in pairs to create larger assault platforms. A strong north wind blew their fleet against the sea walls of the Golden Horn. They finally managed to secure a foothold. A French knight found an unguarded postern gate. The Byzantine defense suddenly collapsed. Alexios V, seeing that all was lost, fled into the night. The city was left leaderless. What followed was one of the most shameful and brutal episodes in Christian history. For 3 days, the crusading army subjected the greatest city in Christendom to a horrifying orgy of destruction, greed, and violence. They burst into the city's countless churches and monasteries, desecrated them without a second thought. The Hagia Sophia was subjected to the worst profanities. Soldiers tore down the great silver iconostasis, smashed priceless icons, stripped the altar of its gold and gems. They drank wine from sacred chalices, placed a prostitute on the patriarch's throne, who sang lewd songs to mock the Greek faith. Enrico Dandolo and the Venetians were more systematic in their looting. While the French knights grabbed whatever they could, the Venetians went straight for the most valuable treasures and sacred relics. They seized the 4 great bronze horses from the hippodrome. These horses would soon adorn the facade of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. They plundered churches for the holiest relics, pieces of the true cross, countless saints' bones which they shipped back to Venice to enhance their city's prestige. When the chaos finally subsided, Constantinople was a smouldering, violated ruin. The blind Doge had his revenge. The Byzantine Empire had been toppled. Venice stood ready to claim its share of the spoils. With Constantinople shattered and its treasures plundered, the victors faced the monumental task of dividing their spoils. The great Byzantine Empire, which had stood for a millennium as the eastern bastion of Christendom and the heir to Rome, was no more. In its place, the Crusaders established the Latin Empire of Constantinople. They elected one of their own, Baldwin of Flanders, as the first Latin emperor. This new empire was a feudal state modelled on Western European kingdoms, a bizarre and ill-fitting construct imposed upon a hostile and resentful Greek population. It was a hollow crown, ruling over a ruined city and a fractured territory, destined for a short and troubled existence. French knights busied themselves with doling out dukedoms and baronies. Enrico Dandolo and the Venetians focused on a far more strategic prize. According to the treaty they had signed before the assault, Venice was entitled to 3/8 of the Byzantine Empire. Dandolo, however, was not interested in acquiring vast tracts of farmland or troublesome provinces in the Balkan interior. His choices were a masterclass in geopolitical precision. He hand-picked strategic ports, coastal fortresses and key islands along the maritime trade routes. He claimed Crete, Euboea, and the most important harbours in the Peloponnese and along the Dardanelles. This created what became known as the Venetian Maritime Empire. This was the true victory for Venice, the ultimate fulfillment of Dandolo's grand strategy. The Republic now controlled a chain of fortified naval bases that secured its commercial lifeline to the east. Its ships could sail from the lagoon to the Black Sea, stopping only at Venetian-controlled ports. They had effectively eliminated their primary commercial rival and seized direct control of the most lucrative trade network in the world. The Crusaders had won an empire, but it was Venice that had won the game. The Latin Empire would struggle for its entire 57-year existence, constantly at war with resentful Byzantine successor states and Bulgarian invaders. Venice, in contrast, had secured a low-maintenance, high-profit commercial monopoly. The Fourth Crusade had begun as a holy war, but it ended as the most successful corporate takeover in medieval history. After the conquest of the city, an electoral committee of 12 Venetians and 12 Crusaders was formed to choose the new emperor of the Latin Empire. Given his central role in the Crusade's success and his towering authority, Enrico Dandolo was the obvious and leading candidate. The prospect was tantalizing. The blind Doge of Venice could now sit on the ancient throne of Constantine as the first Latin emperor of Constantinople. Yet, with a display of supreme political calculation, Dandolo refused to even be considered for the imperial crown. He formally withdrew his name from contention, directing the Venetian electors to vote for Baldwin of Flanders instead. But it was the exact opposite. It was his final and most brilliant strategic move. Dandolo understood that the imperial title was a poisoned chalice. The emperor would be bogged down in endless land wars, responsible for governing a hostile population, and constantly begging the West for money and soldiers. Dandolo had no interest in being an emperor. By refusing the crown, Dandolo ensured that Venice remained independent, free to exploit its new position without being burdened by the responsibilities of imperial rule. He let another man wear the heavy crown while he kept the real power. He already had everything he wanted. He had his revenge. He had secured Venice's commercial supremacy. The title of emperor was a hollow vanity compared to the concrete reality of Venetian power he had just established. The blind Doge had no need for a throne. He had already won the war, and he had won it entirely on his own terms. Enrico Dandolo never returned to his beloved Venice to enjoy the fruits of his victory. He remained in Constantinople, the city he had both conquered and avenged himself upon, to oversee the consolidation of Venetian power. Now in his late 90s, he continued to govern the Venetian quarter of the city and direct the Republic's affairs with a firm hand. He was the most powerful man in the Latin Empire his counsel sought by the new emperor, his authority undisputed. He had outlived his enemies, outwitted his rivals, and achieved every one of his audacious goals. In the spring of 1205, the old Doge finally succumbed to his age. He died in Constantinople, the city that had defined his life from his early diplomatic missions to his final, brutal triumph. His death marked the end of an era. In a final powerful symbol of the new order he had created, Enrico Dandolo was not buried in his native Venice, but in the grandest cathedral in his conquered city. He was laid to rest within the upper gallery of the Hagia Sophia, the mother church of Eastern Orthodoxy, that his own army had so recently desecrated. The choice of burial place was extraordinary and deeply symbolic. To bury a Catholic, a Latin and a Venetian Doge within the most sacred space of the Greek Orthodox faith was the ultimate statement of conquest. It was a permanent stamp of Venetian dominance on the heart of the defeated empire. For centuries, his tomb, marked by a simple stone slab, served as a potent reminder to the Greeks of their subjugation and to the Venetians of their greatest triumph. Centuries later, after the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, the Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque. During this transformation, Dandolo's tomb was allegedly broken open, and his bones were thrown to the dogs, a symbolic act of reversing the Latin desecration. Today, a simple cenotaph, a memorial marker installed in the 19th century, marks the likely spot of his original grave. The legacy of Enrico Dandolo is as complex and controversial as the man himself. For the Republic of Venice, he is a national hero of unparalleled stature. He secured the city's wealth and power for the next several centuries. The Venetian Golden Age was built on foundations Dandolo laid, artistic, cultural, commercial. The treasures he brought back transformed Venice. For the wider world, and especially the Greek people, his legacy is villainy. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 is seen as unforgivable barbarism. Many historians say the Fourth Crusade paved the way for the Ottoman conquest. The moral stain of the Fourth Crusade remains indelible. It exposed hypocrisy beneath medieval piety. It showed how a holy war could be perverted by greed and ambition. The schism between Catholic and Orthodox churches was made permanent. The hatred and bitterness created a chasm never fully bridged. Enrico Dandolo stands at the center of this complex legacy. He was a man of his time in a city that prized profit and pragmatism, personal ambition, strategic genius, sheer force of will. He was a patriot to his people. He was a monster to his enemies. His story reminds us history is shaped by individuals' choices. So what can we learn from the blind Doge who toppled an empire? The story of Enrico Dandolo is more than just a dramatic tale of revenge and conquest. It is a timeless lesson in the nature of power. He was a master of what we would today call soft power and asymmetrical strategy. He understood that he did not need to be the strongest player on the board, as long as he could control the game itself. His genius was not in wielding the sword, but in manipulating the man who held it. He showed the world the immense power of finance. Before Dandolo, debt was a private matter or a king's problem. He turned it into a geopolitical weapon. He understood that by indebting the crusading army, he owned it. He could dictate its targets, its timeline, and its purpose. Dandolo was also a master of exploiting the faith and ideology of others. He took the Crusaders' genuine piety and turned it into a tool for his own, very secular, ends. He cloaked his commercial ambitions in the language of justice, practicality, and even piety, such as when he himself took the cross to justify the attack on Zara. Ultimately, the story of Enrico Dandolo is a chilling and awe-inspiring study in the architecture of power. He never saw a battlefield, he never lifted a sword in anger, yet he conquered more than almost any general of his age. His life is a testament to the power of vision, even without sight. It shows that the greatest strategist is not always the one with the biggest army, but the one who best understands human nature, its piety, its greed, and its desperation, and knows how to turn it all to his advantage, reshaping the world from the shadows. Thank you for watching. Subscribe and give us a like. See you in the next video.